Medieval womanhood was a three-option buffet: menstruate, reproduce, or rot, sometimes all in the same week. Puberty didn't just mark fertility, it marked employment under God's reproductive regime. In England, the church forbade girls from joining convents before age 12 because that was apparently too young to serve Christ, but just right to serve husbands. Pregnancy was mandatory. Survival was optional. In 1420s, Florence, 1 in 5 women died in childbirth, and that was considered progress. The caesarean section, only performed after the mother was already dead, a parting gift for the baby. They were expected to confess, conceive, and comply. Bleeding monthly meant impurity. Bleeding out in childbirth meant redemption. Either way, a woman got buried. It was a system so holy they called pain in labor a divine punishment, thanks Genesis 3:16, and then denied her alcohol during the screaming because drunkenness was a sin. It was blood at the start, blood in the end, and a midwife with a bucket in the middle. Chastity belts weren't oppression, they were haute couture, a hardware upgrade for insecure husbands with money and trust issues. The myth says men locked them on before going off to crusade. The truth: most women couldn't afford shoes, let alone medieval lingerie made of iron and paranoia. In 1405, the Italian poet Christine de Pizan wrote about female virtue, while the priests lectured about Eve and sin. Guess which version got printed? The average peasant wife didn't need a chastity belt. She had a dairy pail, 14 children, and a fused spine by 30. No one cared what women wanted. They cared what women represented: sin, scandal, and somebody else's property. Eve took a bite of fruit, and medieval theology turned it into generations of unpaid labor and mandatory silence. Women couldn't preach, couldn't testify, and in some towns like 13th century Toulouse, couldn't even wear red without being fined for lust. Morality was color-coded, and it always bled. Their choices: marriage, convent, or execution, ideally in that order. Widows were expected to remarry by the next sunset or risk theft, rape, or the church, managing their assets, by which the bishop meant all of it. And childbirth, that was Russian roulette in a hay pile. In 1427, 20 of women in Florence died giving birth. Caesareans were only done post-mortem, like gutting a pig that had dared to dream. They were banned from universities, barred from guilds, and if they dared to learn Latin, they could be accused of witchcraft, because clearly education had to come from Satan. They had no rights, but they had rights. Holy water, holy relics, and if they got lucky, a priest willing to bless their womb, so the baby came out head first instead of corpse-shaped. That counted as health care. Virginity wasn't sacred, it was taxable. In 13th century England, if a peasant woman refused marriage, she owed a fine to her lord for the economic loss of unused reproductive organs. The church called it merchant. Everyone else just called it routine exploitation. Her choices were breed for her master, pray for a husband, or rot in a nunnery making ink for bishops who thought women were defective males. Thanks Aristotle. In 1484, the Malleus Maleficarum declared that witches steal genitals by sorcery. Not metaphorically, literally. A uterus could be demon-haunted now. Pregnancy didn't mean motherhood, it meant penance. Midwives weren't just caretakers, they were informants. In France, they worked double shifts, deliver bobbies, and report unwed women to the bishop. Fatal complications, God's judgment, stillborn child, congratulations, the soul in limbo and you're next. Medieval women carried their own burial shrouds into labor. That wasn't dramatic, that was policy. Ah yes, holy matrimony, that delicate sacrament where love met law and both got clubbed by the book of Ephesians. In medieval Europe, a man's home was his castle and his wife was the furniture he could hit. Clerics like the ever-charming Thomas Aquinas reminded everyone that women were defective males, basically test runs with emotions. And the Bible, weaponized like a belt. Ephesians 5:22 gave husbands divine license to discipline their wives, not a rule, a responsibility. In 1322, for example, English common law helpfully clarified that a husband may beat his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb. Romantic. That bit of judicial poetry is where we get the phrase rule of thumb. Violence didn't break the law, it was the law. Even better, ecclesiastical courts handled domestic abuse where priests all male and all celibate passed judgment on whether a woman deserved it. Spoiler, she usually did. Complaint without bruises. She was lying. Complaint with bruises. God was testing her. The Virgin Mary wept, but only for the men. God helped the woman who bled, literally because no one else would. In medieval Europe, menstruation wasn't a biological function. It was demonic housekeeping. Church writings claimed women bled because of Eve's sin, which is a poetic way of saying, we don't know how uteruses work, but we're angry about it. By the 13th century, theologians like Albertus Magnus were debating whether menstrual blood could sour wine or kill crops. Spoiler, it couldn't. But try explaining that to a monk who thought a red stain meant Satan had made a house call. There were no pads, no tampons, just rags and shame. Maybe moss if you were rural and unlucky. Hygiene was medieval code for bleed in silence. And if you got too loud, meaning God forbid irritable, possession wasn't off the table. In 1487, the Malleus Maleficarum warned that witches used menstrual blood in love potions. Good luck surviving cramps when the local priest thinks your uterus is casting spells. Pain relief, prayer, sanitation, lice, compassion burned at the stake, and still they called it the curse, as if they hadn't written it themselves. Midwives weren't delivering bobbies. They were delivering potential heretics. If the infant died, it was their fault. If it lived weird, probably still their fault. Any woman present at childbirth was one cough away from being burned as a sorceress or banned from communion for sneezing between contractions. The church's official position. That female pain in labor was divine punishment courtesy of Eve. You weren't allowed to ease it. Midwives using herbs got accused of interfering with God's will. God apparently preferred hemorrhaging. In 1487, Kramer and Sprenger's Malleus Maleficarum declared midwives the most dangerous class of witches, mainly because they had unchaperoned access to naked women, which according to theologians meant orgies, demons, and baby blood on the ceiling. Their medical instruments were crude knives, cord prayer, and the occasional amulet. One recipe to ward off a breech birth involved wolf dung, angel feathers, and exactly zero logic. Postpartum hemorrhage, that's just God closing the womb. Infection, that was Satan's signature. And when mother and child both died, bloody, fevered screaming, it was still better than surviving and being accused of consorting with devils. Medieval women didn't win the fight against demons. They were held accountable for losing it. Medieval society offered women 3 career paths: saint, sinner, or livestock. Virginity was currency, marriage was a transfer of property, and motherhood was a death sentence with diapers. If she spoke too freely, she was a heretic. If she didn't, she was obedient and still replaceable. Theologians like Albertus Magnus swore women were more carnal than men, which is rich coming from a monk cataloging sin like it's amateur taxidermy. In 1322, the Synod of Exeter declared menstruation evidence of moral impurity, as if childbirth wasn't punishment enough. Wombs weren't sacred. They were liabilities. Cows got better shelter. Childbirth killed more women than the sword ever could, because in medieval Europe, God might protect you on a battlefield, but he apparently took coffee breaks during labor. Every daughter was a holy vessel until her first contraction. After that, just another name to write on the parish wall in soot. There were no doctors, only midwives, saints, and superstition layered like plague dirt. In 1420s Florence, 1/5 of women died giving birth. They were told to confess their sins before the pushing started, just in case the baby came out screaming and the mother didn't. Anesthesia didn't exist. Clean hands were heresy. Caesarean sections were only performed after death, literally. If you were sliced open while alive, it meant your surgeon had skipped confession and medical training. They called it divine judgment. Mostly it was hemorrhage. Women wrote their wills in the 3rd trimester, naming godparents and burial cloth. Death was so expected, survivors were the surprise. If the child lived but the mother didn't, they wrapped the newborn in swaddling bands and whispered prayers it wouldn't eat turnip mold before Lent. A knight died for glory. A woman died in a ditch surrounded by blood goats and villagers arguing over placenta disposal. And that counted as mercy. Childbirth wasn't a miracle. It was a judicial sentence, 9 months to prepare your soul, then flip a coin. Noblewomen prayed, peasant women screamed, and everyone bled. In 1420s Florence, 1 in 5 women died giving birth, and that was considered a good parish. The church, in its infinite empathy, recommended women write their wills before their water broke. Get your affairs in order. Kiss the relic of St. Margaret. Push until something dies. Most did, sometimes both. The cradle and the coffin had a shared carpenter. They called it God's work, because nothing says divine mercy like sawing through a pregnant woman's pelvis with a kitchen knife and a verse from Psalms. Medieval childbirth wasn't medical, it was theatrical. Women in labor were told to confess, clutch a blessed candle, and hope the Virgin Mary was in a good mood. Midwives weren't trained, they were tolerated. Surgeons, when summoned, arrived with bone saws, not anesthesia. In 1450, a caesarean was performed only if the mother was already dead, sometimes not even then. And if she lived, she was still expected to thank the saints for surviving an ordeal that could have killed her and the cow beside her. In 1428, the Church of York ruled that women who died in childbirth must have already sinned because God doesn't botch stitches, only souls. That was the logic. They got pain. Men got inheritance. Her uterus was a battlefield. Her tombstone was proof she lost, and that counted as progress. Born poor and female, congratulations, your property with a uterus. Labor began at birth and ended at death unless you died giving birth, in which case it ended there. Girls learned their value early, 1/3 the ransom of a son, half the inheritance, and the full burden of sin. Theological bonus round Eve did it, so now they all pay. In 1285, a woman in Lincolnshire was publicly flogged for scolding. Her crime: speaking too much in church. That counted as witchcraft-like. No vote, no land, no mirror unless you count the puddle behind the pig pen. And if all went well, she married at 12, popped out 10 kids, buried 5, and died with dirt under her nails and wool in her lungs. The ointment for menstrual cramps: boiled toad. Not a metaphor. They called it woman's work. It meant everything a man didn't want to do, plus childbirth with no help from anesthesia saints or mercy. She owned no land, no name, no spine in the eyes of the law, but somehow she still owed everybody rent. Married women couldn't own property in 13th century England unless they were wed. And even then, half the village tried to reclaim whatever she'd borrowed from her late husband's corpse. She bled, she cooked, she prayed, she birthed. Then she apologized for doing any of it too loudly. Canon law labeled her naturally inferior, which is medieval Latin for unpaid labor with breasts. In 1285, a French peasant woman was fined for scolding her husband with persistence. Meanwhile, the husband was fined nothing for throwing her into a ditch. That was called balance. She paid tithes, she paid taxes, she paid in children and in teeth and in years shaved off from childbirth. Half died, the other half repeated it. She paid for everything. But even her deathbed didn't belong to her. It belonged to her husband's heirs. She was just dying on loan. If a woman was raped in medieval England, her trauma came with paperwork. The law didn't weigh morality, it counted silver. According to the 12th century Glanville legal code, rape was framed less as a crime against a person and more an insult to property. Had she been a virgin? Did her father lose marriage value? Congratulations, it was now a dowry dispute. Punishment: a few coins if the family sued, more often nothing. In 1281, a girl was raped near Oxford. The man married her, that counted as mercy. And that's what passed for justice: forced vows to your rapist and a discount bride price. Wedding vows included "till death do us part," but they forgot to mention what happens after that. In 1321, the widow of Rouen was dragged from her home and dumped outside the parish wall for refusing to remarry. Her crime: inconvenience. No husband meant no function. She became a breach in the divine plumbing. Highborn widows fared slightly better. They got locked in convents like political compost. Meanwhile, Hindu customs exported their own horror: widow burning. Sati made grief a group project. It wasn't just mourning, it was mandatory self-erasure. Chastity was optional, unless you were poor female and mildly inconvenient. Then it was sacred. Nunneries weren't sanctuaries, they were storage closets. Families stuffed extra daughters into veils to save on dowries or avoid inheritance drama. It wasn't faith, it was estate management. In 857 AD, noblewomen in Metz were forced into convents en masse to protect church property from their future marriages, because nothing says holy vocation like house arrest with incense. Inside, rules Latin and isolation. The Benedictine rule banned laughter. Enclosed orders banned conversation. Nuns wrote less poetry than prison letters. Male clergy called it Bride of Christ. Historians might call it kidnapping with hymns. Witch hunts weren't a moral panic, they were a travel trend. Misogyny had gone on pilgrimage. What started as local gossip outside church in Trier or Toulouse became a pan-European sport with torture manuals. Thanks to the Malleus Maleficarum, a 1487 bestseller written by two monk inquisitors with mommy issues, women were no longer just sinners, they were infectious. In Scotland, Agnes Sampson was shaved bald, pricked with needles, and strangled before they burned her. Her crime: midwifery and knowing the weather. Being useful was all the proof they needed. Faith was mandatory, so was death. Female education in the Middle Ages was simple: memorize the Bible, don't ask questions, and if you read too much, we'll hit you with something wooden. Maybe a switch, maybe fate. In 1222, the Council of Oxford banned women from university lectures. Couldn't have them overhearing Aristotle and getting ideas about metaphysics and menstruation, now could we? The best you could hope for was a convent school, where nuns taught you to sow suffer and conjugate passive verbs like your marriage contract. Girls learned obedience through catechism and fear. Knowledge that didn't reinforce virginity or housework was heretical at best, satanic at worst. In 1486, Heinrich Kramer helpfully explained in Malleus Maleficarum that women were more impressionable and carried lust in their marrow. Charming stuff, the medieval equivalent of an after-school special with burning at the stake instead of commercial breaks. If a woman wrote a book, the villagers lit a fire. If she asked to learn Latin, they called a priest. St. Hildegard of Bingen managed to sneak her way into apocalyptic visions and musical theory, but only because she claimed divine revelation. Everyone else got knitting needles and a warning. And if you wanted to teach, no chance. A woman caught reading aloud from a non-religious text risked the pillory or worse, marriage. The stick was discipline. The Bible was curriculum, and the diploma was survival. Courtly love was marketed as chivalry dipped in rose water, knights composing verse for ladies they weren't allowed to touch. In practice, it was poetry-flavored harassment with a lute solo. The woman's job: smile, blush, and pretend that Sir Geoffrey's 17 stanza breakdown of her eyebrows wasn't just a slow-motion power play in iambic pentameter. By 1277, Bishop Etienne Tempier of Paris banned teachings that gave women too much credit, like reason, agency, or souls with original ideas. Love was fine. Women thinking: heresy. Marriage contracts didn't need her consent. Her veil meant silence, her dowry meant property shuffle, her vows meant breeding stock on holy retainer. The church called her a vessel, the law called her a transaction. Only the poems called her divine, mostly because she couldn't talk back. Eleanor of Aquitaine sponsored troubadours who praised ladies, spiritual beauty, while her own daughter Joan died giving birth at sea alone, exiled by politics. Romance was currency. The collateral was female. And every time a knight professed undying love in rhyme, another girl got married at 12 and bled to death by spring. If a medieval woman wore too much silk, she was a whore. If she wore too little, she was poor. If she spun her own thread, she was useful, until winter came and her fingers turned black from frostbite and prayer. According to England's 1363 sumptuary laws, only a wife of a knight could wear velvet, and only if God hadn't already punished her with childbirth that week. The laws cared more about cloth than consent. Fashion wasn't survival, it was evidence. Dress wrong and starve. Marry wrong and die screaming. No pants, no rights. No problem unless you were female in 1347, a year when men debated the weight of angels while women bled out in straw beds. Legally, a woman's voice didn't count in court unless she was widowed noble or channeling divine stigmata. Even then, a goat had better odds if it was male. Per canon law, she was spiritually weaker. Per common sense, she just worked harder and died faster. In England, the 1351 Statute of Laborers tried to cap women's wages after the plague wiped out the workforce. Because God forbid a peasant girl earn more than a cow. She belonged to her father, then her husband, then her grave. A choice between marriage and the nunnery, though most convents had waiting lists longer than sin itself. And childbirth, more a death lottery. In 1363, Florence women went into labor drafting their wills. Welcome to the 14th century. No pants, no voice, bleeding in Latin. A pale face was the goal, which worked out because everyone was anemic anyway. But the nobles took it further, slathering on ceruse, a lead-based face paint that whispered, "I'm rich and dying slowly." In 1520, Queen Elizabeth, I wore it thick enough to blind a sundial. Her hair fell out. Her teeth turned black, but the look, immaculate. Meanwhile, peasants enhanced their beauty by chewing fennel seeds and gouging fleas out of their scalps. Papal bulls said vanity was a sin. Death by cosmetics didn't count. Holiness was internal. Poison was just fashion. Hysteria wasn't a condition. It was a lifestyle if you happened to be a woman and alive between the 5th and 15th century. Feeling anxious, demonic possession, moody, sin. Publicly annoyed that your husband smells like a bog witch, call the priest, grab the leeches. In 1322, the surgeon Henry de Mondeville recommended bloodletting as the most reasonable treatment for female disorders, especially if a woman cried too much, talked too little, or had opinions on anything besides embroidery. Basically menstruation with extra steps. Midwives had to swear oaths in churches not to perform abortions, but men could legally beat their wives in France under the rule of thumb, so small sticks were fine, just not sterile instruments. Blunt trauma was apparently more godly than contraception. In England, women couldn't testify in court unless the crime was treason or witchcraft, because naturally eyes that menstruate are unfit for witnessing theft, but perfect for spotting Satan's influence in a neighbor's chicken. Every woman was a vessel and none of them owned the cargo. Punching, bleeding, starving, that was health care. And childbirth, that was the grim lottery. By 1400, death in labor was so routine that priests handed out last rites like breath mints. And when they died, nobody called it a tragedy. They called it modesty, obedience, divine reward. They called it Tuesday. Silence wasn't golden. It was legally enforced. According to the 829 Council of Paris, women were forbidden from speaking in church unless spoken to, which sums up the entire job description of womanhood for the next 600 years: silent, obedient, replaceable. Free thought got you labeled a heretic. Free movement a scandal. Free will, hilarious. England's assize of bread and ale fined women brewers for unseemly conduct, which meant existing without permission. Meanwhile, nuns were praised for starving themselves quietly in stone cells. That was considered virtuous restraint. And childbirth, less miracle, more biological Russian roulette. In 1373, the Trotula, a medical guide for obstetric care, suggested that difficult labor might be due to the woman's horoscope. If a mother or child survived, it wasn't thanks to medicine. It was because God didn't feel like killing someone that hour. Most died whispering prayers. The lucky ones screamed. Married at 12, pregnant by 13, dead by 20, and medieval society called that stability. The church preferred wives young and obedient, which conveniently aligned with a lifespan one cough away from sainthood. Henry II's law codes let fathers marry daughters off around puberty, because menstruation meant available, not still learning to read. Most weren't. Once married, a woman's job was simple: survive childbirth without bleeding to death, or at least confess before she did. Caesareans were only performed if the mother was already dying, and often so was the midwife. In 1427, records from Florence showed 1 in 5 women died giving birth. No anesthesia, no antiseptic, just screaming, swaddling, and a priest sweating nearby with a portable box of last rites. That counted as health care. And if she didn't die in labor, there was plenty more forced fasting during Lent, while pregnant penitential bleeding to humble the womb, and the occasional folk remedy like warming the uterus with fried mouse broth. Yes, broth, from a mouse. No childhood, no privacy, no second chances, just 20 years, 5 funerals, and a gravestone that said mother and wife, because there wasn't room for human. God made women weak, so the church made it policy. By the 13th century, women were labeled defective males by theologians with ink-stained fingers and untreated syphilis. Tertullian called them the devil's gateway. The rest of society just called them useful. When food ran out, and it always did thanks to weather patterns straight out of Revelations, women got the last scraps. In the Great Famine of 1315, mothers were arrested for eating their children. One chronicler in St. Albans wrote it down without flinching. Pregnancy wasn't survival, it was sentencing. Midwives weren't trained, just blamed. In 1322, a woman in York was fined for witchcraft after her patient died screaming in the dirt. The priest showed up late and took the bedding. If the plows failed, it was sin. If the womb failed, it was sin. If the weather rained blood, frogs, and skulls, also sin. Women bled for every mistake they didn't commit. God never starved. They did. Plague. Must be the women, said a continent that stored sewage under its floorboards and thought prayer could outgun bacteria. When the Black Death arrived in 1347, men in robes pointed at midwives' widows and anyone who didn't weep attractively enough during funerals. In Switzerland, they burned women alive for witch butter, still warm from the churn. Childbirth was a public execution with fewer witnesses. In 1420s Florence, 1 in 5 women died pushing out another heir no one could afford to feed. Blood loss was blamed on sin. Sometimes they labeled it menstruation, heavier than usual. A dowry was a gift, they said, a bride price wrapped in linens and livestock. In reality, it was a bribe to get men to overlook the inconvenience of a woman's existence. Families bankrupted themselves haggling over a daughter's uterus like it was a seasonal investment. Poor girls brought nothing and got nothing. Rich girls brought land and got locked inside of it. In 1286, English records list Alice de Brienne's dowry as including 5 manors and a swan-shaped silver ewer. Her husband got property. She got pregnant. The church called it holy matrimony. The creditors called it a liability. A woman's worth was measured in cows' coins and how quietly she died in childbirth. If she lived, she became her husband's property, legally indistinguishable from his ox. If she died, the contract was void. Returns not accepted. No woman owned herself. She was sold, silenced, and sentenced, with ribbons tied around the rope. Milk was warm, bread was black, and every meal doubled as a trust fall with death. Medieval women didn't cook. They waged chemical warfare with bad cheese and unwashed hands. Butter churned with cow dung still on the udder. Wheat ground at the village mill where rats relieved themselves directly into the flour. And that was the highborn diet. Peasant women scraped lichen off stale bread and called it seasoning. In 1379, English records warned pregnant women not to eat windy meat. Spoiled mutton blamed for miscarriages and demonic possession. By then the womb was already considered a liability, a cursed jar full of bile, blood, and original sin. Hunger was constant, filth was ambient, and death was baked into every loaf. Bon appetit. The nicest thing anyone could say about a medieval convent was that at least the walls kept out husbands, which in a society where forced marriage counted as character development was basically salvation in stone. Most women didn't land there by choice. They were dumped, surplus daughters, inconvenient widows, dowryless embarrassments, shoved behind a crucifix so no one had to feed them. Inside, cold floors, bad bread, and a lifetime of prayers no one answered. In 1247, Henry III ordered London's nuns to stop begging door to door. Too many were escaping. It was that or childbirth. And childbirth, statistically speaking, was murder. In 14th century Paris, over 20% of women died in labor. That's not a mortality rate, that's a blood offering. If the baby survived, it would probably die in the next 3 years anyway, coughing up soup and demons while the midwife blamed the stars. So no, they weren't holy. They were hiding. And frankly, that counted as progress. A woman in medieval Europe could be accused of witchcraft for knowing which herb stopped cramps. Meanwhile, a monk in Avignon could bottle his urine and call it a cure. That was medicine. She was murder. The law said she was property, the church said she caused original sin, and her neighbors said she probably hexed the livestock. In 1322, a woman named Alice Keitler was accused of sorcery, partly because her husbands kept dying, which in fairness is often what husbands did back then. Her maid was tortured. Alice fled. Justice was served. And by justice, we mean gendered panic with a splash of holy water. She could marry or she could pray, and praying didn't come with lunch. Medieval womanhood was a to-do list written in blood: obey, conceive, bury, repeat. The church handed Eve the bill for original sin, and nobody checked her receipt. St. Jerome said a woman is the gate of the devil. The devil took notes. In 1373, the Bishop of Exeter ordered any pregnant nun to be locked in the convent and left to deliver in private reflection. Reflection here being code for excommunication and slow starvation. Childbirth was roulette with 2 loaded chambers. Bleeding, fever, rupture, death. all before anyone lit a candle. Caesareans existed, post-mortem only, meaning if she needed one, she was already a coffin with opinions. Florence's Libro del Popolo recorded 1 in 5 women dying in labor during the 1420s. The book had margins. It did not have names. And still they spun wool-cooked grain-sowed souls back into broken children, then died nameless between a prayer and a dung heap. Fields remembered more horses than women. History forgot her, on purpose. They remembered the kings who got fat, the monks who got drunk, and the popes who excommunicated dead people out of spite. But not her. Not the girl who bled to death at 15 because the parish midwife used a fishbone to cut the umbilical cord. In 1393, the Church of St. Mary in York fined 2 women for brewing beer without a man's permission. Technically, that was a sin. Technically, surviving was one too. Marriage was mandatory. Love was irrelevant. Consent was French. Once her dowry was spent and her womb was emptied into a tiny cloth-wrapped grave, she became an accessory. A witness to male piety, a sinner by birth. According to St. Augustine, even her silence was suspicious. If she confessed too slowly, she was a witch. If she bled too often, she was cursed. If she spoke at all, she could be stoned in Toulouse under the 1286 sumptuary edict for wearing silk above her moral station. Her story was carved in bone, not ink. And that's why it vanished. Dust doesn't get footnotes.